comments on yesterday's minutes, so they are thus adopted. And let's turn to the first item for debate today, this afternoon, which is a statement by the Vice President of the Commission and High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy on the global gag rule. On behalf of the Vice President, Commissioner Stylianides will address us. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My dear colleagues, honourable members, on behalf of my dear colleague, Vice President, High Representative Federica Mogherini, I'm here, and as you know, President Donald Trump has reinstated the Mexico City policy with a presidential memorandum on January 23. This policy requires foreign non-governmental organizations to certify that they will not perform or actively promote abortion as a method of family planning as a condition for receiving US global health assistance. This also includes NGOs receiving funds from outside the US. The policy, when in effect, applies to foreign NGOs as a condition for receiving US family planning support, either directly or indirectly. So, the Commission is concerned about the possible implication on our objective to reach universal coverage of health and reproductive health services, particularly in developing countries. Eventually, this decision might also impact on our sustainable development goals, targets to reduce maternal mortality, and to empower women to more informed decisions about their health. In the poorest countries of the world, this can put the lives of young women and girls at risk, and we don't want that the progress we have made over the past decade on women's rights is lost. Let me be clear. European Union policies are driven by our own priorities and values, not by what others do or stop doing. As far as humanitarian aid is concerned, and as Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, our approach is based on needs. Our humanitarian partners that consider abortion will be appropriate are not prevented from doing so. We have never issued instructions to the contrary. A decision on abortion will depend on various factors: the women's wishes after receiving all relevant information, definitely her condition, and the legal framework of the country, of course, which could influence the security of both the women and the humanitarian workers. In this context, decisions on how to treat women and girls are always better left to doctors. It's not something for lawyers to prescribe. Let me also add that at the same time, we continue our work for the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence. Focusing on the treatment of the violence can only ever be a second best. Prevention is also the reason why we strengthen the place of gender in our humanitarian aid. Over the past decade, the Commission has allocated around €200 million annually from the humanitarian budget to health care, including sexual and reproductive health. In parallel, my dear colleague, Commissioner Neven Mimica, issued a press statement on the 1st of February, current year 2017, underlining that the Commission will continue to play a leading role in ensuring women's access to health and family planning services around the world. Also, Neven Mimica attended the She Decides event on the 2nd of March 2017 and reiterated our commitment. Several governments and private philanthropists have pledged nearly $200 million for family planning services. We are also assessing the potential impact of the funding of the UN Population Fund. The funding gap could be large. Together, notably with Member States and civil society, we are analysing the US contribution to the fund and what best approach to take. We remain strongly committed to support global health initiatives such as UNFPA, where we are putting €20 million for 2016 and 2017, but also the Global Fund, to which we pledged €475 million for 2017 until 2019. Or Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to which we pledged €200 million for 2016 until 2020, and the partnership programme with the World Health Organization in Luxembourg, worth €28 million for 2016 until 2018. The informal Foreign Affairs and Development Ministerial meeting on Thursday will allow for addressing the matter. We will only have an impact if we respond together with a common European position. Thank you so much for your attention.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie komisarzu.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I suggest that we first take speeches on behalf of political groups and then individual members' presentations, and catch the eye procedure at the end, and then the Commissioner will take the floor again. Mrs. CORAZZA, BILDT, EPP, you have the floor.
Commissioner, for everything you are doing. I strongly condemn the newly reinstated global gag rule. We had an alarm call from Africa through Asia to Latin America for the serious consequences on hundreds of thousands of women and girls' global health. And today my thoughts really go to all these women and girls who's risking of losing very important health programs, like also on Zika virus, on AIDS prevention, on prenatal and postnatal basic assistance for babies and young women, victims of rape, victims of female genital mutilation. The risk is that women's mortality is going to increase and that there will be more illegal and unsafe abortion. Last week we were marking the International Day of Women. We met fantastic women from Tunisia, Morocco, Kosovo, all over the world. We were told terrible stories of a woman that was found a piece of a television antenna in her uterus because she wanted to interrupt her pregnancy. Another one had drunk pesticides and died. Not to talk about the victims of ISIS and Daesh slavery, and the girls then come back having been released from Boko Haram, refused from their communities, and could not, in the new circumstances, get assistance for their basic health and reproductive rights and for their children. We are talking about is not, are you for abortion or against abortion? We are talking about humanitarian law, health, safety, child protection. And women's rights are human rights. No woman or girl should have to risk her life to have a baby. That's what we are talking about. And there is a chorus of concern that is coming from NGOs, Save the Children, the United Nations. Europe has to step in. This is our opportunity to show leadership. The Trump sexism is as bad as the problem that we have with security in Europe and with free trade with the new administration. I'm glad that She Decides campaign has been so successful. I'm glad that today we have voted to devote European funds to compensate this setback. I hope that more pledges will come, and the test is going to be, Mr. Chairman, next week at the United Nations Conference on the Status of Women. I hope member states, and I call on member states to do their part and to raise their voice. Let's continue to support the Women's March in the US, in Europe, and women's health in the world. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo za tak porywające wystąpienie, jednocześnie gorąca prośba.
Thank you very much for that very enthusiastic speech. And I'd like to compliment those speakers who stick to their speaking time and urge them to. Mrs. McAVAN now has the floor. And I'd like to begin by asking her to stick to her time.
In the week we're debating women's issues after International Women's Day and just a few days after the conference in Brussels on She Decides. This is a debate we shouldn't really be having, because a woman's access to family planning should not be a political football to be given and withdrawn depending who's in government. And it particularly doesn't seem right to me that it's a decision that's been taken by people who will not be affected by it. People here will not be affected by this decision, and certainly the men who surrounded President Trump when he signed it into law, they will not be affected by this decision. It's the poor women in the world, in the poorest countries in the world, who will pay the price. The women we heard from at the She Decides conference on the 2nd of March. So if we're serious about, as the Commissioner said, about the SDGs and gender equality, then we can't afford the cuts that have been talked about. An estimated 225 million women globally lack access to modern contraception. Every day, 830 women die from preventable causes linked to pregnancy and childbirth. That's over 30 an hour. It's one since I started speaking to you. And no family planning means, as we just heard from Mrs. Bildt, other problems, HIV, and other issues. And let's have no mistake about it. Cutting this funding does not mean fewer abortions. All the evidence from the last period when the gag was in place shows a number of unwanted pregnancies and abortions increased when the global gag came in, and the consequences Mrs. Bildt just told us about, what happens to women when that happens. So it's not a success story, this policy, and that's why she said we must step in, but we must also step up now. So what can we do here in the EU to counter this policy? Well, we voted today. We voted the report by Claire Moody this morning with a very big majority, calling for EU funds to counter the cuts caused by the global gag. We can support the She Decides initiative, and I pay tribute here to Lilian Ploumen and the Swedish, Danish and Belgian ministers who organised that conference and brought over 50 countries together to raise funding. We can also look at our own wider funding, prioritise SRHR spending in our own plans. We've got a review of the DCI coming up and of the EDF in the mid-term. Let's look at what we're doing already. Commissioner, you indicated that the Commission was willing to do this, and we'll be talking about it in the Council on Thursday with ministers. I hope you'll come back soon and tell us that the funding is being made available, that we will back the She Decides initiatives. I look around this room, many of us here, women here, mainly women here, but men as well, we've made choices about our own fertility, if and when to have children. It's not a first world right. It's a right for every woman, wherever she lives. And I know, Commissioner, you will be supporters on this, but we need support of the whole Commission and ministers to make sure that women are not let down after this gag comes in place. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł McAVAN. W imieniu...
Thank you very much, Mrs. McAVAN. And now on behalf of the ECR group, Mr. Škripek.
Thank you, dear Chair. Yes, women must have a good quality health care, especially when it concerns the unique contribution to our society of having babies. So, my opinion is, why would anyone, especially those calling themselves feminists, complain that the global abortion industry is losing some of its funding? Why are EU member states wanting to step up and fund a practice that harms women and babies? That is genocidal, economically disastrous, and anti-democratic, and anti-feminist, and anti-woman. And if someone has a different opinion, if President Trump decided for a different approach, it has to be respected. There are reasons. And also there are reasons which come from reverence. Reverence to life, reverence to dignity of life, reverence to the right to be born, to live, and reverence to those who cannot speak for themselves, for those who are unborn yet, and they not speak for themselves. So I strongly disagree with the Commission's intent to spend millions to export this barbarism to developing nations. Abortion has no healthcare benefits. There is none. And it cannot be called a health care. Abortion is not a health initiative, as Commissioner Stylianides named it, because it cannot be called a basic health care. All of those valuable resources should be immediately redirected to provide real and maternal care to women, so that we can benefit from the next generation and not mourn them. Thank you very much for listening.
Bardzo dziękuję. Jest pytanie, czy przyjmie pan...
Thank you. There's a blue card, Mrs. Lunacek. Do you accept to reply? Ms. Lunacek, please ask your question.
Thank you, President. Mr. Škripek, can I ask you whether you have ever spoken to a woman who got pregnant even though she didn't want to? Because maybe the man she had sex with didn't want to use a contraceptive, or it broke, or she maybe have been raped. That even happens inside families. That happens by brothers, by husbands, etc. Have you ever spoken to any of them who said no, she did not want to have that child? And maybe just another question. Have you ever imagined what would happen if you were able to get pregnant and you wouldn't become pregnant? Would you then, maybe if the dire circumstances like we have in many countries in this world, would you then not decide that you will not want to have that and you want to have safety, a safe access also to abortion, because otherwise you could die and the child as well?
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę pana o odpowiedź.
Thank you. You have only 30 seconds to reply, please.
Okay, I don't know if I manage, but two questions along 50 seconds, probably you need to answer in 30 seconds. So, of course, I did speak to a lady who was in a difficult situation. What I condemned on this industry is that it's a mixed thing, all reasons into one. Let's help children to be aborted, let's fund it. But the other side does not speak about the very different approach which admires life. This is what I'm missing on this pro-life and pro-choice debate. A lady does not kill its own body, cannot decide about its own body, because it's not her body. If she kills her body, she dies. After abortion, dies a baby, not a lady. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. W imieniu...
Thank you. Now for the Liberal Group, Mrs. Sophia in 't Veld, you have the floor.
Well, I'm not sure what to say to Mr. Škripek, because I don't have the illusion that we're going to change his minds, but maybe I would rather address the citizens of the European Union, who should understand that the agenda of the so-called populist parties is not just about nationalism, anti-EU or national sovereignty. It's also very much about sexism and misogyny. It's against women's rights. So keep that in mind when you go to the ballot box and know what you vote for. like the Trump administration, who reinstated and expanded the gag rule and the Helms Amendment, which was still in the background. It's very, very necessary that the European Union gives a strong response, and I very much welcome the very positive attitude of the European Commission. You have our support, because the European Union must not only accept standards imposed by third countries, we must lead in the world. We must set the standards. We are the strongest actor in the world, and we have to make sure that we impose the standards and don't accept. And that's why I very much welcome the She Decides initiative. It sends a very, very strong signal to the Trump administration and women around the world. But we need to go further. So first of all, I would like to ask the European Commission about the 2015 letter about women who are pregnant as a result of rape in conflict, and you consider that that is covered by international humanitarian law. But now we need to make sure that these guidelines are actually transmitted to the practitioners in the field, so that people know that they have the backing. Women should know what their rights and their options are. So I would call on the Commission to do this proactively. Secondly, we need to fill the funding gap that was left by President Trump, but not only in response to him reinstating the gag rule, but it has to be structural. Again, if we want to lead, it has to be structural. And then finally, we're going to table amendments to the budget this year in order to strengthen the funding. Now, I also expect those EU member states, I'm coming to a conclusion, Chair, those EU member states who have pledged funds to the She Decides initiative in the budget procedure are going to give support to amendments increasing the budget for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and not only in situations of conflict, because, dear colleague Škripek, I firmly believe that women should decide on their own bodies, always.
Dziękuję bardzo panie komisarzu.
Thank you. Commissioner, you have heard some questions and proposals, so I would ask you at the end of our part of this procedure to reply.
Every Republican presidential administration in the USA brings in this global gag rule, but this misogynistic gang has gone further than ever before. They now pretty much ban all support for women's reproductive health. Good sexual and reproductive health care for women is a matter of life and death on this planet. It's also a question of whether women can live a life in full or only a half life. It is a matter of whether she has control over her body and her sexuality or not. This is shows such disrespect for women and for health and their well-being. Pardon my language, but who the hell do they think they are? We will not be silenced or gagged. The EU, like every member state, must now stand up. I welcome the She Decides initiative. It is an important part of the answer, but it is insufficient. The Commission and the Council have been silent. What is the EU going to do, both politically and as regards financing? The European Parliament has acted, we have voted, and now we want to see more financing, more support for sexual and reproductive health for women. We also want to see the Council and the Commission act. We want clear recommendations as to how our partner organisations can guarantee that they will continue to deliver sexual and reproductive health care, including abortions. A proposal for more appropriations for SRHR and women's health, and I would say that one's commitment in decency is put to the test when one faces adversity, and it is now that if we really mean what we say about women's rights in the EU, must ensure that we take up the fight. We have to condemn the USA's gag rule. We must take up the fight in international fora and commit more money, and I look forward to the decisions by the Council and the Commission. Thank you.
Dziękuję pani. W imieniu Grupy Zielonych pani Terry Reintke.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Terry Reintke now, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues. We call it the global gag rule, but what are we actually talking about? We are talking about the lives and the well-being of millions of women worldwide. We are talking about girls to get support after being victimized by female genital mutilation. We are talking about maternal care for pregnant women. And Mr. Škripek, I find it a shame that you are insulting family planning organizations here as an abortion industry who are sometimes risking their lives and their well-being to help women who are at risk of having serious health damage. I think that this is unbelievable and that we should not accept this as parliamentarians in this chamber, because they are doing great work. We are talking about access to contraception here. We are talking about providing sexual education. But we are also talking about the power over family planning for women. Thus, we are talking about the freedom of women to decide about their own lives and to be equal parts of society. We are talking about progress in these societies. We are talking indeed about the Sustainable Development Goals. And sadly, we are talking about an old white man in the White House who, as one of his first actions in power, has threatened all of these things. Approximately $600 million can be lost. We cannot let this happen, Mr. Commissioner. So I urge you, increase the EU funding, counteract and fill this decency gap, but also bring a very clear message to our colleagues in the US. We will fight for the freedom and the self-determination of women and girls all over the world as the European Union. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Dziękuję bardzo pani.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reintke. Mr. Škripek has raised a blue card, but I wouldn't want this to become a debate simply between Mr. Škripek and the lady members here. So I will now give the floor to Mrs. von STORCH.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Today we're talking about the funding for abortion organizations. The US doesn't want to fund that anymore, and the EU now wants to make up for that funding shortfall. But abortion is not an EU competence. Surely we can't fund anything for which we're not competent. How would we do that? And in Germany, abortion is still an offence. It's only in certain exceptions that it's not an offence. And we should stop talking about reproductive health and defending children. It's about abortion. It's about ending the life of an unborn child. I don't think the other issues we need to discuss any longer. Now, we need to stop want to fund these things for which we're not competent and which in certain countries are offences. I suggest that we defend protecting life rather than ending life.
Dziękuję bardzo pani.
Thank you. Mrs. Stork, there's a blue card that's been raised. Would you take the question? Yes? You have the floor. Mrs. Forenza.
Seconds, please.
Volevo chiedere all'onorevole se considera.
Could I ask the Honourable MEP whether the right of women to terminate a pregnancy is something that, in her view, the EU should become active in, given that the UN has stated that this is a fundamental right for women? Could I invite you to think about the following? If you stop women from deciding what happens to their own body, then how can you say that it has nothing to do with the EU?
Bardzo dziękuję. Również 30 sekund na odpowiedź.
Thank you. You have 30 seconds to reply, please.
Also, die Global Gag Rule, da geht es exakt um.
The global gag rule is about abortion and about nothing else. It's about ending life. And if you keep talking about women having rights to their own body, of course they do, yes. But in 98% of the cases where you have abortion, it's not because of someone being raped, it's because someone taking that decision to end their life.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Mrs. In 't Veld, you wished to ask a question, but I'd like to introduce the single question rule with regard to blue cards and limit members to one card. You may be able to ask a question of a later speaker, but we need to have some rules if we're to get ahead with our debate. So, and now for ENF, Mrs. ARNAUTU.
Tous les prétextes semblent bons dans cette émission.
Well, it seems that any pretext will do in this hemicycle to attack the new American president, who you accuse of hegemony, and you've also attacked the president of Russia on the basis of his family planning policy in his country. So the United States will no longer serve to try, that is, to impose political standards inherited from May 1968 on the rest of the world through family planning organizations. The US desire to overturn traditional family values and structures and to foster abortion all across the planet was not a good thing, was not wise, and Mr. Trump's restoral of the Mexico City policy, which Mr. Reagan also applied, which bans NGOs who finance abortion, shows that the old world is collapsing. So much so that the new socialist government in France has felt it necessary to ban internet sites which simply present alternative solutions to people who are thinking of aborting. And I didn't hear the defenders of tolerance raising an outcry about that. In fact, the left wing and the soft end of the right wing tend to agree on attacking Mr. Trump, and it's up to the United States government to decide on its own criteria when it comes to financing foreign NGOs. And political groups and media and so on in Europe have not latched onto this simply to encourage anybody. I would remind you that Mr. Trump has been democratically elected. There are people who tend to ignore national sovereignty, international rule of law, at a time that 50 million people lose their lives due to abortion through the world each year. This really should become a matter of public policy, as entered into in the Cairo conference in 1994.
Czy pani przyjmie pytanie?
Thank you very much. Mrs. Arnautu, would you take a blue card question? Yes? Yes, please ask the question.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Dear colleague, I think in our discussion you're mixing up two issues. You're comparing Trump to Putin, first of all. Could we here in this hemicycle please stick to the matter at hand? We, as the EU, want to let the President of the US, Mr. Trump, know that women's rights apply to all women and that they need to be respected across the world. Now, of course, we've known your position for a long time, but you're speaking out against abortion, and that means that you speak out against the right to self-determination for women. Every minute, women in this world are dying because they're undergoing unsafe abortions, and that's what we want to bring a halt to. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pani Arnautu, prośba serdeczna, 30 sekund.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Arnautu. 30 seconds.
Et je suis un député.
Well, you will have noticed that I'm a woman. I'm a French MEP. What I see is that for the last 20 years in my country, there have been 200,000 abortions each year, and despite all of the information campaigns, the number of abortions isn't coming down. And I'd also say that there's been many such information campaigns, and unlike what you say, this is what you said is not truthful. We're not against information on the rights that are out there. We're simply in favour of the right to inform women about another alternative. And since you talk a lot about international law, I would remind you that an obligation that has been entered into by France and most member states of the EU vis-à-vis the Cairo Convention is the obligation to support children before and after their birth, and to take appropriate measures for women so that they may be able to avoid abortion. No more, no less. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Škripek, a formal question? Under what rule?
Mentioned that according to the rule of EP, I was named by Mrs. in 't Veld and Mrs. REINTKE. I was named by name, and I had the right to react. Thank you very much.
Jeżeli pan chce zareagować, bardzo proszę po zakończeniu.
If you wish to react, you may do so. At the end of this debate, you'll have up to 3 minutes to make your personal statement. Okay? Let us now return to our debate. We've had all of the speakers on behalf of political groups, and now we will hear from members on their own behalf.
Dear Mr. Chair,
Novost, ona postoji.
Is nothing new. It has existed ever since 1984 and is fully aligned with international conventions and the action program adopted at the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, as well as the Peking Declaration and Action Platform. What is key in these documents is that abortion is not a family planning method, and funds have been withdrawn exclusively from those organizations promoting abortion as a method of family planning. The funds have not disappeared, nor have they been reduced, as has been wrongly stated. They are still here and will go to those organizations involved in women's and children's health. Abortion, when used to save the life of a mother, is not subject to this policy. Also, in cases of rape or incest, these cases have not been included in this gag, nor is the post-abortion care included. So there are no financial gaps to be filled when it comes to family planning. The gap has been created only when it comes to abortion as a method of family planning, and this is illegal in most developing countries. So if the NGOs abide by the law of their respective countries and do not carry out illegal abortions, they shouldn't be affected by this policy. I am resolutely against the idea that the EU financially supports families promoting abortion as a method of family planning in third countries. The funds on behalf of the EU should be distributed to those organizations taking care of health of women and children, and not those who openly promote abortion as a method of family planning. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, pani poseł. Jako następna.
Thank you very much. Now we will hear from Mrs. Arne LIETZ.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, es ist eine
Mr. President, it's a scandal that the US government and Trump have stopped financing healthcare, and 18 million illegal and unsafe abortions take place, and there's going to be an increase in all of that, which means that in the case of rape there will be no safe abortion possibilities left open. Mrs. von STORCH from the EFDD shows in what she says where she stands, and the important thing is the EU should get the US decision revoked as soon as possible. The lack of money now, which needs to be filled, and quite a few countries have stepped forward. Germany, unfortunately, as yet hasn't established its own position on it, so I would call on the European Commission to ensure that appropriations are swiftly made available, and the EU budget for 2018 must also see an extension of funds for sexual and reproductive health. The world stands together if faced with this responsibility, with political goals that have already been decided. There is a right to good health. This counts for women. It's a human right. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję panu Arne LIETZ.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Arne LIETZ. We'll now hear from Mr. Marek JUREK. Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that President Trump is trying to put a stop to abortions in the world is a good example of where the US is going wrong. But here there are people attacking the US, and those are the convulsions of an ill Europe. The global gag rule is basically the President of the US just calling a halt to an industry of death. The socialists in France have introduced censorship and use it as a gag rule against those who want to let children be born. We need to oppose this populist activity in Europe.
Niewykorzystanie 4 sekund dla nas, każda sekunda tu ma swoje.
Thank you very much. 4 seconds shorter. That's great. Mr. Charles Lorenz now.
Président, prenons un exemple concret pour illustrer le drame créé par le globe.
President, let's take an example of the drama involved here. To save a woman's life in a conflict area, the treating doctor sees no solution but to end their pregnancy with agreement with the patient. Does he have to explain details of American legislation to this woman, or does he just take care of her? The doctor thus saves a life, but is liable to see his NGO being deprived of all future aid from the US. We'd like to say from here today to that hypothetical doctor that we support him. We find the choice that the global gag rule places him in front of unacceptable. The choice between saving the woman's life or allowing his NGO to go on existing. It's a matter of blackmailing the humanitarian sector. The doctor needs to act in line with his or her conscience, and that's what the EU should be doing too. I've just recently heard from Mrs. STORCH an eloquent plea in favour of the right to life. I would ask her where she was when it was suggested that refugee seekers crossing the border should be shot from time to time. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję panu. Następnym mówcą.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Mrs. Ángela VALLINA.
Gracias, presidente. Desde luego el nuevo gobierno de Estados Unidos.
Thank you, President. Certainly, the new US government has declared war on feminism by cutting finance to NGOs which work to provide information and to help young women who wish to interrupt their pregnancies to do so in a safe and secure fashion. This is unacceptable, and that's why we should respond with state funds and EU funds to this challenge raised by the US. Commissioner, please remember that last month this Parliament adopted recommendations to speak out, that you should speak out firmly against this gag rule at the relevant UN meeting next week. You have to do that because women's rights are not something that should be bartered depending upon the colour or the party of the government in power, inside the EU or outside it. Women's rights should be permanently guaranteed. This and a woman's control over her body is something that should be guaranteed. The free use of always, no obligations from anyone.
Bardzo proszę pani Heidi.
Thank you very much. And now Mrs. Heidi HAUTALA. And please follow the example of the previous speaker who only spoke for 1 minute.
Trump's global gag rule goes much beyond and much further than his predecessors, another Republican president, Mr. Bush. We don't quite yet know how far it goes, but we can estimate that the work of non-US based NGOs in all areas of global health assistance, including family planning, will be jeopardized. And this will directly threaten lives of hundreds of millions of women and girls in the world. What we know also that the Bush rule during its 8 years added 36 million unwanted pregnancies to the world, and it added 15 million abortions. Is this what you want? This is certainly not what I want. I want to get rid of this kind of hypocritical interventions which are calling for a total ban or even criminalisation of abortion in the name of some obscure ideology in defence of life. What we need is to look at what really works, and what really works, if we can look for instance in Nepal. In Nepal, abortion was legalised in 2002, and we have seen that immediately maternal deaths started to go down in numbers. We can also say that a good quality sexuality education with a permissive abortion legislation is the best way to bring the numbers of abortion down. If that's what you want, then change your thinking.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pani poseł, czy pani przyjmie?
Thank you very much. There's a blue card from Mr. Jurek. Do you accept, Mrs. Hautala? There's a...
Bardzo proszę, panie pośle.
Zdaniem pani poseł, państwa, które chronią życie przed urodzeniem...
Madam Hautala, countries that protect the rights of unborn children are countries that, in my view, are on the right track. Do you think Mr. Schuman was a politician?
Schuman certainly was a great European politician. I'm not disputing that. But I'm sure that if you want to get what you want, you have to look at figures. You should not just say that ban abortion, stop supporting abortion services. And as I said, what we are seeing now is that it's also going to be a stop of real family planning methods. So we all have to be very proud that the European Union did fight against this rule during the Bush era, and I'm convinced that the European Union will have a very sensible and courageous approach in this question even now.
Dziękuję bardzo. Następny mówca jest pan Raymond FINCH. Bardzo proszę.
Thank you.
Mr. Finch, please.
While I believe it's an obvious right that women's health issues are a concern for us all globally, I also believe it's the right of every nation to spend its taxpayers' money in the way it sees fit. The fact of the matter is, this is a decision for the government and people of the United States of America, and to call it a war on feminism, as someone did, is hyperbole and just demeans your arguments. We must look back in history and acknowledge that this legislation is a political football, even in the United States. Its origins go back as far as the Reagan administration. It's been brought in and rescinded by previous administrations as the Republican and Democratic fortunes have waxed and waned. Now, the powerful religious factions who support this in the United States have a precise analogue here in Europe, where the Catholic Church strongly opposed your own Sandbeck report. Issues of this kind are heavily emotive, and each person must reach into their own moral core to decide how to speak and vote. In the end, I believe it is not for the European Parliament to tell the American government what to do. You would not be pleased if the positions were reversed. So I would like you to urge you to consider this point. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Finch. Should you accept the blue card?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pani in 't Veld, bardzo.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to clarify one misunderstanding, we are not actually debating the US budget here. We're debating the EU budget. And we may deplore what the United States have decided, but we cannot change it. But if you say that every state or entity, in this case, when we're talking about the EU budget, has the right to set its own priorities and decide on its own budget, then I suspect that I will, or I count on you being on my side when we are going to table amendments to raise the budget for the issues we're discussing today. Thank you.
Dear colleague, The fact is, it's entirely up to the EU how it spends its budget. As you are aware, doubtless, I'm not in favour of the EU having a budget, but I would be greatly in favour of individual nations, and I don't believe this is a nation, doing so, if that answers your question.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czyli debata trochę zeszła na temat.
Thank you very much. We seem to have strayed off topic a bit. I suggest we go back to the issue at hand, and I'll give the floor to Mrs. Le Grip.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too would wish to express my great concern about the global gag rule. This rule that President Trump has brought back into being in the most severe form imaginable and in an extremely sinister way. It's more severe than any of its predecessor gags. And as a consequence of the American global gag rule, international organizations and associations which deal with family planning and put together actions to promote the sexual and reproductive health of people will find themselves deprived of any funding from the US. The alarm cords have been pulled by many of the large associations in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, by the United Nations Population Fund and by the Save the Children Fund. So hundreds of thousands of women and young girls run the risk of finding access to healthcare being cut off. This could well happen, and access to family planning as well. And they might once again find themselves forced down the road of illegal backstreet abortionists, and we know how extremely dangerous that is for the health and well-being of women and young girls. And particularly with the budget cuts, there's a whole series of preventive measures that are stopped. The fight against AIDS and the Zika virus, which may find that is deprived of financing. So the EU and its member states must now continue to support humanitarian actions and development policies which take into account the need to promote actions that promote reproductive and sexual health throughout the world. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, pani Le Grip.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Le Grip. And now, Mrs. Schlein, you have the floor. Thank you, President. The US administration under Trump is scandalous, and I think it's time the EU speaks out in favor of sexual and reproductive health for women. The US initiatives don't just go against gender equality as we see it in the EU, but will also have disastrous consequences for the NGOs that are involved in family planning, that try and combat diseases and allow for abortions and the health of children and women, also in developing countries. The global gag rule will lead to a $600 million shortfall in funding. And the She Decides initiative from the Dutch minister is an excellent initiative and should be supported by all our institutions. It's not enough just to be indignated. Member states now need to react and need to make sure that their own contributions can be increased and that this is new money, not money coming from other priorities. Women need to have the right to decide over their own bodies, and it's as the 8th of March demonstration said, my body, my choice.
Bardzo dziękuję. Jako następna mówczyni bardzo.
Thank you very much. Mrs. MLINAR, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. With the stroke of the pen, the President of the US has changed the agenda for sustainable development to 2030, putting it at great risk and exposing women to the fatal consequences of this senseless action. It's not a question of potential savings, it's a question of the female body and the rights of women once again being used as a political tool. And this could have life-threatening consequences for women. unsafe abortions are one of the 5 most frequent causes of female mortality worldwide. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is high time to stand up. It is down to us in the European Union to collect data and to promote a progressive global alliance. We cannot simply stand by and look on when policy is of this kind is made conventional. It's important that we and our partners do continue to support sexual and reproductive health worldwide, and development aid must pay attention to that. So too must it be made an integral part of our diplomatic relations. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Następny mówca.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Forenza.
Eleonora.
Mrs. Forenza, you're the next speaker. Are you here? Mr. President, I spoke to this issue, but so did 100,000 women, because on the 8th of March they took to the streets on the International Day for Women, and President Trump, of course, sent out a horrible picture of himself surrounded by women. I was horrified to see that, and I must say I'm angry, because even today in this august assembly I've heard MEPs who speak against my right as a woman to decide over what happens with my body. Now, of course, the shortfall in funding is going to affect 460,000 young women, in particular weak women, women in difficulty, and we can't allow this to happen. Let me remind you that in the EU there are still 14 member states that haven't signed up to the Istanbul Convention. We need to distance ourselves from the policies put in place by President Trump, but that said, we have our own work to do as well.
Dziękuję bardzo. Z przyjemnością bardzo proszę.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ulrike LUNACEK.
Mr. President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, you'll probably all remember when Trump signed the global gag rule, surrounded by a whole bunch of old white men, maybe some young ones as well. But this means, year on year, about $600 million no longer being made available. This is not just a question of abortion, it's a question of contraception, of awareness raising and AIDS prevention. So it's all to do with the lives of women and girls, and if you go to backstreet abortionists, this is one of the most frequent causes of the deaths of young women between the ages of 15 and 19. And if you wish to argue against that, you're simply trying to do your bit to defeat it. And so in the European Parliament, we have to support a program called She Decides. This is a new initiative by the Dutch ministers. It's also supported by Belgium, Denmark and Sweden, and that must continue. And in a few weeks' time, over 180 million euros will be put to its cause, and I'm really disappointed that my own country and its government, Austria, is not prepared to chip in. I think it is incumbent on every member state in the EU to do its bit and to ensure that more is done, because the principle of that the feminists wish to apply in the 60s is still the case. It's my body, I decide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I give the presidency over to Ms. McGuinness, Mr. Frunzulică will take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Documentation and analysis of the impact of the global gag rule has shown that the policy restricts a basic right to speech and the right to make informed health decisions, as well as it harms the health and lives of poor women by making it more difficult to access family planning services. It has also been found that the policy does not reduce abortion. I strongly believe we cannot make any compromise on gender equality. It is the world's poorest women and girls who will bear the brunt of any funding cuts. The EU has to ensure effective implementation of its international aid programmes in view of the restrictions imposed by partner donors. In light of the current developments, the European Union's role in defending the rights of women and girls through its international aid becomes even more important. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for 1 minute, Madam Engström.
Tack fru ordförande, herr kommissionär.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Commissioner. I'm directing myself to President Trump and anybody who thinks that they can decide on a woman's body and their right to have an abortion if they want to. It's becoming more difficult for women, and so they're doing it illegally, which has great risks for their life and effects on society. It's a question of life and death. I'm taking up the battle for women's rights and reproductive rights. 2 million women are mothers before they're 15, and they need more support, not less. That's why President Trump and others don't want to give them the right to their own body. The governments in Europe must do enough. And she decides. Sweden, together with others, is behind the She Decides campaign, has gathered 80 million euros for sexual and reproductive rights, and there is greater resistance against the global gag rule. Thank you.
Thank you. For 2 minutes now, Madam Garcia Perez.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. It is calculated that 225 million women in developing countries would like to delay pregnancy or prevent pregnancy, but they have no access to contraception methods, and there's no health facilities. More than 800 women and girls die every day for reasons linked to pregnancy and delivery, even unsafe abortions. 800 a day. So let's not get it wrong. We're not dealing here with a debate about abortion, yes or no. The gag law from Mr. Trump's administration, what it does is to block financing for all those family planning organizations that are working in the area of health and saving women's lives and facilitating access to family planning methods and measures for preventing unwanted pregnancies. So therefore it's necessary, I think, that we convey this message here. We're very sensitive about this issue because this is putting in jeopardy the lives of millions of women. Now the Commissioner has said that there is a commitment from the Commission as regards for funds for this area, but we're asking for more. We want there to be a commitment to make up for the lack of funding that's been caused now by the gag law. So we welcome the initiative from the Dutch government, from Cityside, to make up for these lack of funds. And recently, in a report adopted in the European Parliament on a majority basis, we asked for a bigger contribution from European institutions as well in this area. We're talking about the life of millions of women who can't have access to family planning methods. If they do, it's only thanks to NGOs and their efforts, and NGOs deserve our very warm thanks for the efforts they're making. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for 1 minute now, Madam BLINKEVIČIÚTË, please.
Thank you, President. You will know that in the February plenary, the Parliament adopted its recommendations to the Council on the EU priorities for the 61st session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. Well, the Parliament strongly condemned the so-called global gag rule because it believes that this rule is a direct attack and a step back in the area on women's and girls' rights. Moreover, this rule may mean in practice that many related health and disease prevention programs in third countries will suffer financially, such as, for example, maternal and child health, fight against Zika virus, or fight against AIDS. And this is what we cannot permit. This is why I believe that the European Union, given the situation, simply must strengthen its support to third countries in the field of family planning through EU humanitarian aid and development assistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Arena, for 1 minute, please.
Merci. Thank you very much. When the Trump administration takes the decision to stop funding NGOs simply because these NGOs are financing services which respect the rights of women to information about sex education, and this is going to deprive millions of women of access to contraception, and it will force women to have illegal abortions, and will increase the number of deaths of women, but also lead to fistulas, and also AIDS prevention will be hindered. And so we have to have a position. We're not criticizing the US position. What we have to look at is what our role is, what we have to do in terms of rights and women's rights, and I think that is our duty to compensate for what the Americans are no longer doing. I think that it's important for us to make up the funding gap. Thank you.
Merci. Michel Martin, 1 minute, please.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam President. The global gag rule has been one of the first Trump executive orders. It hasn't just decided to reintroduce it, also to extend it. This rule doesn't just hit family planning organizations, but all NGOs within global sense health provide sexual and reproductive health assistance. So it's not just about public aid. NGOs shouldn't talk about abortion, even using their own funds. This means that any funds that don't auto-censor themselves to be gagged. It's 600 million euros over the next 3 years, which are threatened. We will hold up this campaign, and the EU and the member states who are silent should abandon these funds. It's the freedom of choice and women's rights that are threatened. Commissioner, what initiatives will you take to have a collective response based on solidarity to this?
And now for 1 minute, Mr. Tang.
Ja, voorzitter.
Chair, Donald Trump plays with the media, but we're now seeing the details of the global gag rule. Hospitals can no longer have access to funds, and this is having a direct impact on the most vulnerable women, and the rights of these women shouldn't depend on who sits in the White House. Following the decision by Trump, she started a campaign and has managed to raise over 200 million. And we need to give every support we can to the She Decides movement to counter the steps taken by Trump. And I hope that member states will now make a substantial contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to Catch the Eye, and I have 6 speakers on the list. So our first speaker, Madam Šojdrová, for 1 minute, please.
Místopředsedkyně za udělení slova.
Thank you very much, Chair President. The EU is known as the biggest donor for development aid in the world, and looking after healthcare is part of our aid program, our development aid program. Therefore, the EU finances medical aid, and above all, it finances basic primary health care in many, which is often lacking in many African countries. So I don't agree that the EU money should be used for abortions. I think this goes if you go beyond efforts to save lives. If the EU should be doing something, it should be financing primary healthcare, which will save lives and not destroy them. The EU should be financing education and primary provision of primary healthcare. And abortion is not preventive medical care. And I don't think that this ties in with the financing of this programme.
Julie Ward, please.
Donald Trump is certainly proving the substance of his misogyny to the world, because stifling global funds for women's reproductive health was one of his first acts as president. Shutting us up, keeping women and girls subordinate, starving women's health programmes in the poorest countries of the vital money they need to save lives is in itself an act of violence. Therefore, I applaud the European governments who have come together and pledged to replace US aid money that is being pulled away worldwide. Let us all commit here to replace every dollar withdrawn with money from Europe, and I hope that the Commission and all EU governments will step up to the mark. However, my own UK government has not yet committed to the initiative, and I think that Theresa May, holding hands with President Trump, hoping for a trade deal at any cost, shows that she has lost international credibility on issues such as this. It's only through solidarity and cooperation that we can turn back this misogynist tide. Let's show this un-President Trump that it is our body, our choice, our rights.
Mr. Marias, 1 minute.
Thank you. I think that through this debate, what you can see is that there is a very obvious conclusion that this gap in the financing which we have because of this new US policy needs to be covered by the European Union, member states. Europe itself should find the funds, and to do that we need to find ways to have funds, because obviously we need to support the third world, we in Europe, and obviously we need to inform citizens in those areas and disseminate information. We need to educate them on reproductive and sexual health, and we need very specific interventions. So instead of wasting time in criticizing US policy, what we need to do is to search for ways through which Europe can fill in that gap, and I think that that's the direction towards which we should all be moving. Thank you.
Madam Vautmans, 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Just a week, it'd only been 1 week in office when President Trump introduced the global gag rule. But even his Republican predecessors did the same thing. But with all of his sexist comments, I think that all women here are affected. And America is a global player, and that is why the EU must react. We need to be tougher. We need to say that is not acceptable. We cannot undermine women's rights, because that's what we're talking about. He's reducing the funding, but he's also making sexist comments. And so we should support She Decides. Our Belgian minister was at the meeting, and what you felt there was really phenomenal, and I'd like to feel that here in the Parliament as well. And that's why I want to ask the Commissioner, what are we going to do to fight effectively against it? Are we going to top up the funding for She Decides, and what are we going to do against all these sexist comments?
For 1 minute now, Mr.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This decision is a decision which influences mainly poor women. It has implications for poor women, and we should resist this. This is our debt. We are the EP, and we should support these women. The gag rule is an insult for women globally, and we can't accept this drop in resources, but we should find ways to substitute for these cuts, because this will lead to abortion not in health centres, and you know how terrible the consequences can be. So I think we should send a clear message to Mr. Trump.
Thank you. And our final speaker on the list is Mr. EPITIDEIOS. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very serious issue. Abortion is a very serious problem, and this is something that came to the fore because of the recent decision of the US government not to finance NGOs that support abortion. This is not an issue that you can deal with through financial or political decisions. Undoubtedly, women have the right to decide if they will interrupt pregnancy or not. But also, undoubtedly, abortion is a crime. It's the murder of an innocent and defenseless being. So you can see how terrible a dilemma is for a woman when she has to think of interrupting a pregnancy. And the implications are not only corporal but also psychological for a woman, whatever her decision might be. So if we want to deal with this issue and support families, we need to properly educate our girls and inform young women all over the world, so that if they ever need to go through this terrible dilemma I've just mentioned, to be able to do it in the best possible way.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Commissioner Stylianides to respond. Thank you.
Thank you for this timely discussion, very constructive and very productive. Also, thank you for your suggestions and questions. And I will try to meet your concerns and your worries. First of all, you may be assured that the European Commission will remain alert on this issue. We have to remain alert on this issue. But also, let me reiterate once again, our action is not dependent on others. And I would like to be clear. Our policies are driven by our own priorities and by our own values, not by what others do or stop doing. At the same time, if we see a funding gap in development and humanitarian aid, we will look into stepping up our assistance to health and gender-based violence projects, should that be needed. And of course, I count also on the European Parliament's support to reinforce the budgets. My final point, last but not least. Some colleagues refer to the need to inform our partner organisations on the ground. As far as I'm concerned, we have over 200 humanitarian partners on the ground in humanitarian and development field, registered in the EU, and they know better what to do on the ground to help women in need. I have witnessed their knowledge and their action in my missions on the ground around the world. On the other hand, our partners work with local implementing organisations. If there is an information gap there, I stand ready to discuss with our partners how best to address this without compromising humanitarian access and the overall safety of the people in need and the humanitarian workers. This is my promise regarding the information of our humanitarian partners and, of course, regarding the possible funding gap. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner. And before I close the debate, Mr. Škripek has asked to make a personal statement under Rule 164, which we will now invite him to do. But I would just observe that, as you will be aware, you may not speak on the substantive matter, but obviously address observations or rebut remarks that have been made about you in person. So I'll give you the floor under Rule 164. Thank you.
I shall not answer the question I was given, because I objected that I was named by Mrs. in 't Veld and by Mrs. Reintke, and I was named because of the content of this debate. So I feel my right to answer. So please explain me your objection, if I cannot speak about the content of this debate. Because, you know, Mrs. in 't Veld did not attack me, she gave me a real question about this debate. Also Mrs. Reintke. So I don't feel attacked, I feel challenged by the question. And they named me by name.
Okay. As you know, I wasn't the President in office during that exchange. What I would propose then, rather than address this now, because the debate is now almost formally finished, is that in the minutes of the sitting, you could address the issue that was raised. Perhaps, had I been in the chair, I could be much more specific. But because this was left to the end of the session, and under Rule 164, there are very particular issues that can be addressed rather than the substance of the debate. So, with your permission, if you would be happy to address this in the minutes of the session, we could accommodate that. Thank you. Thank you.
So it should be in record what I want to express?
Yeah, because if it was a question and was raised in the format of normal questions, blue cards, then it should have been addressed at the time of the debate. I was not the President in office, so I cannot make that judgment now, but I would ask you to talk to the services and we will address your concerns in some other manner rather than at this point. Thank you for your understanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, this debate is closed and we will move to the next item on our agenda, which deals with UN priorities for the EU priorities for the UN Human Rights Council session in 2017, a statement by Vice President of the Commission, High Representative for the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And we now